The heavy iron door stood sealed once more, the void beyond it quiet, too quiet. For a moment, the world felt still, as if the asylum had finally relented, releasing its grip on their minds and bodies. But Cassie wasn't convinced. The whisper still echoed faintly in the back of her mind, like a forgotten melody playing just beyond the edge of hearing. They staggered back to the main hall, every step feeling like it could be their last in this cursed place. The air was lighter now, no longer thick with the crushing malevolence that had twisted the walls and floors, but there was something lingering, something unseen. "Do you think it's really over?" Mila asked, her voice trembling. She clutched her arms to herself, her skin pale and glistening with sweat. The asylum had drained all of them. "I don't know," Tristan replied, his eyes scanning the walls as if expecting them to close in again. "It feels different, but I still don't trust this place." Cassie remained silent, her mind racing. The void had felt endless, alive with a dark, ancient energy that she couldn't shake. She had seen into it, felt its pull, and now, even with the door closed, it felt like it was watching her, waiting. "We need to leave," she said, her voice firm, cutting through the uneasy silence. "Now, while we still can." They headed toward the main entrance, the long corridor that had once twisted and stretched impossibly, now seeming more familiar, more stable. But as they approached the exit, Cassie felt a chill run down her spine. The door was gone. In its place, the wall stretched unbroken, smooth stone, where there had once been a heavy wooden exit. The asylum had shifted again, reshaping itself, trapping them. "No," Mila whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "No, no, no, this can't be happening." Tristan pounded his fists against the wall, his voice breaking with frustration. "It's playing with us. It won't let us leave." Cassie stepped back, her heart sinking. The asylum had shifted before, its rooms twisting and rearranging themselves as though the building were alive. She had thought they had weakened it, but it seemed the asylum still held them in its grasp. "We need to stay calm," Cassie said, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "There has to be another way out. We'll find it." But as the words left her lips, a cold, mocking laughter echoed through the halls, soft at first, then louder, filling the space around them. It was the voice they had heard before, the one from the void. It hadn't been silenced after all. "You think you can leave?" the voice whispered, each word dripping with malice. "This place is mine. You will never escape," Mila screamed, covering her ears, as if the voice were burrowing into her mind. Tristan grabbed her, pulling her close, but his face was pale, his eyes wild with fear. Cassie felt the weight of the asylum pressing down on them again, the walls seeming to close in, the air growing thick with dread. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once, an unseen force that twisted around them like a predator, circling its prey. "You came here to destroy me," the voice hissed, "but you only fed me. You gave me your fear, your pain, and now you belong to me." The walls began to tremble, the floor shaking beneath their feet. Cassie's breath quickened as she glanced around, searching for an escape, but the corridors were twisting again, warping before her eyes. "We need to move," Tristan shouted, his voice barely audible over the rumbling. "Now!" Cassie grabbed Mila's arm, pulling her forward, and together they ran, the ground shifting and buckling beneath their feet. The hallway ahead stretched impossibly long, doors flickering in and out of existence as if the asylum itself couldn't decide on its form. The laughter followed them, echoing through the halls, growing louder with every step. "There!" Cassie pointed to a narrow staircase that hadn't been there moments before. "Upstairs." They raced up the steps, the laughter growing distant but still present, always lurking. The staircase wound higher and higher, spiraling upward like a snake coiling around itself. Cassie didn't know where it led, but it was the only path left to them. Finally, they reached the top, bursting through a door that led into a small circular room. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bookshelves, and in the center of the room stood a single large window. Moonlight streamed through, casting pale, ghostly light across the room. Cassie ran to the window, peering out. They were high above the asylum grounds, higher than they had been before. She could see the twisted forest surrounding the asylum, the barren trees swaying in the wind. It's the outside, Mila gasped, her voice filled with disbelief. For a moment, hope flickered in Cassie's chest. They could escape. They could climb out, find their way down. But as she looked closer, her heart sank. The window was sealed. The glass was old and thick, embedded deep into the stone, with no way to open it. They were trapped. Tristan slammed his fist against the window, but it didn't even crack. No, this can't be it. The voice returned, soft and mocking, as though it were standing right behind them. There is no escape. You belong to me now. Cassie's hands trembled as she stepped back from the window. The asylum had brought them here on purpose. It was toying with them, showing them freedom just out of reach, mocking their efforts. "We're not giving up," Cassie whispered, though even she didn't believe her words anymore. The asylum had them, and it wasn't going to let go. The cold air in the circular room felt stifling despite the open window, as if the asylum was drawing the life from them, pulling them deeper into its grip. Cassie paced back and forth, her breath shallow, her mind racing for any possible solution. They couldn't stay here, trapped like rats in a cage, taunted by freedom just outside their reach. "We can't let it win," she muttered, more to herself than the others. "There has to be a way out, a real way." Tristan slumped against the wall, his face a mask of exhaustion. "It's too strong, Cassie. It's playing with us." Mila sat on the floor, hugging her knees, her eyes glassy. Maybe there never was a way out. Maybe we were doomed the moment we stepped inside. "No!" Cassie snapped, her frustration boiling over. "That's exactly what it wants us to believe. It wants us to lose hope, to give in." The voice, that ever-present whisper, laughed softly in the back of her mind. "Hope is a fleeting thing in this place." Cassie shivered but refused to acknowledge it. She wouldn't let the asylum break her, no matter how close she felt to the edge. There had to be something they'd missed, something they hadn't tried. Her gaze flickered over the room. Bookshelves crammed with old decaying volumes, dusty wooden furniture, the heavy stone walls. The walls. She stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing at the cold ancient stones. There was something off about them. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing over the rough surface, feeling for what exactly? She didn't know, but something about this place, the shifting corridors, the vanishing doors, made her wonder if the walls were as solid as they seemed. "What are you doing?" Tristan asked, his voice tinged with defeat. Cassie didn't answer immediately. She pressed her hand harder against the wall, feeling for anything, softness, movement, even a sound. Her pulse quickened when her fingers brushed over a section that felt different, almost hollow. "Help me," she said, her voice rising with sudden urgency. "This wall, there's something behind it." Tristan stood up, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He joined her, running his hands over the wall. "You think there's a passage?" "It wouldn't surprise me," Cassie replied. "This place is alive, shifting. Maybe it's hiding something." Mila, still sitting on the floor, looked up, her eyes wide with fear and a flicker of hope. What if it's another trap? Cassie hesitated for a moment. She didn't have an answer. The asylum had toyed with them from the beginning, luring them deeper into its clutches. But there was no other choice. Sitting here, waiting to be swallowed by the darkness, wasn't an option. "It might be," she admitted, "but it's a chance. We have to take it, together." Tristan and Cassie searched the wall, knocking and pressing until Tristan found the weak point, a thin crack running vertically along the stones. With a few strong pushes, the stones shifted slightly, dust falling from the cracks. "There's something behind here," he said, his voice strained. "Help me push." Cassie joined him, their hands working together to pry the stones loose. The sound of scraping stone echoed in the room as they forced the wall open. Finally, a section of the wall gave way, revealing a narrow, dark passage beyond. Cassie's heart raced as she peered into the darkness. The air that wafted out was stale, thick with the smell of decay and dampness. It wasn't inviting, but it was a way forward. "I don't like this," Mila whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't like this at all." "Neither do I," Tristan admitted, "but it's better than staying here." Cassie swallowed her fear and stepped into the passage. The walls were close, pressing in on either side, the ceiling low enough that she had to duck her head. The darkness swallowed them almost immediately, the only light coming from the faint glow of their phones. As they moved deeper, the laughter in Cassie's mind grew softer, but the sense of unease only intensified. The passage twisted and turned, leading them downward, deeper into the heart of the asylum. The air grew colder, heavier, as if they were descending into something ancient and forgotten. "This place, it feels wrong," Mila whispered from behind. "Like we're walking into a tomb." Cassie couldn't shake the feeling either. Every step felt like it was taking them further from the world they knew, pulling them into something much darker, but there was no going back now. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a vast underground chamber. The ceiling loomed high above them, supported by thick stone pillars covered in strange ancient carvings. At the far end of the room stood an altar, its surface stained dark, surrounded by more of the twisted symbols they had seen before. Cassie's stomach churned at the sight. This is the heart of it, isn't it?" Tristan nodded, his face pale. "It must be. This is where it all began." Mila's voice was trembling. "What do we do now? We can't destroy this, can we?" Cassie stepped forward, her eyes locked on the altar. "We have to try. This is what's keeping the asylum alive, what's been feeding off us. If we destroy it, maybe we can break free." She approached the altar cautiously, every instinct telling her to run, to leave this cursed place behind. But she couldn't, not yet. As her hand reached out to touch the altar, the air in the chamber shifted, the temperature plummeted, and the oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them. From the shadows, a figure emerged, tall and gaunt, its face hidden beneath a tattered hood. Cassie froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its presence radiating a cold, ancient power. "You cannot destroy what has always been," the figure whispered, its voice low and resonant, filling the chamber. "This place is eternal, and so are you." The figure raised its hand, and the symbols on the altar began to glow with a sickly light. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the chamber itself seemed to come alive. "We need to get out of here," Tristan shouted, grabbing Cassie's arm. "Now!" But Cassie couldn't move. The figure's presence held her in place, its words echoing in her mind. Eternal. She could feel the weight of it, the endless cycle that had trapped so many before them. This wasn't just a building. It was something far more ancient, far more malevolent. "Cassie!" Tristan shouted again, pulling harder. With a sudden surge of will, Cassie tore her gaze away from the figure and ran, the others following close behind. The chamber shook violently as they sprinted back through the passage, the walls cracking and crumbling around them. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through the corridors as the asylum came to life, furious at their defiance. The ground buckled, throwing them off balance, but they kept running, desperate to escape the clutches of the ancient evil that now pursued them. They burst back into the circular room, the window still shining with pale moonlight, but the walls were closing in again, the asylum trying to trap them once more. Cassie looked around wildly, her mind racing. There had to be a way out, a real way out, and then she saw it. The moonlight. The window wasn't sealed anymore. The glass had cracked, a narrow opening leading to the outside world. "Go!" she shouted, pointing to the window. It's our only chance. Cassie sprinted toward the cracked window, her heart hammering in her chest as the room seemed to collapse around them. Tristan followed close behind, dragging Mila, who was frozen with terror, her eyes wide and glazed over. The asylum groaned and trembled, the walls twisting as if the building itself was furious at their attempt to escape. "Come on, we're almost there," Tristan shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening sound of stone grinding against stone. Cassie grabbed the jagged edges of the broken glass and pulled herself up, wincing as it sliced her palms. She squeezed through the narrow gap, her body barely fitting through the small opening, the cold night air hitting her like a slap in the face. Outside, the world felt eerily still, too quiet compared to the chaos they had just left behind, but there was no time to think. She turned back to the window. "Hurry!" Cassie urged, holding out her hand. Tristan was next, helping Mila up as she trembled uncontrollably, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The fear had almost paralyzed her, but she managed to climb up, her hand slipping into Cassie's. With one hard pull, Cassie yanked her through the window, just as the walls inside began to crack and split, the air filling with a thunderous roar. But when Tristan tried to follow, the asylum fought back. The window frame buckled, and the glass began to seal itself up again, the jagged edges shifting and stretching, the stone around it moving like a living thing. Tristan's hand slipped from the ledge, and for a moment, it looked like the building was going to pull him back inside, into the void they had barely escaped. "No!" Cassie screamed, reaching for him. "Hold on!" Tristan's face twisted with effort, his muscles straining as he fought against the force pulling him back. "I can't." But just as he was about to lose his grip, Cassie caught his arm, her fingers digging into his wrist with desperate strength. With one final, agonizing pull, she dragged him through the window. Just as the asylum's shrieking walls closed the gap, the glass sealing up behind them with a final, ominous snap, the three of them tumbled to the ground outside, gasping for air, their bodies shaking with adrenaline and terror. They were free. For a moment they lay there, staring up at the sky, the cold earth beneath them a stark contrast to the suffocating air inside the asylum. The forest loomed around them, the twisted trees swaying in the night breeze. But for the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't trapped. Cassie slowly sat up, her hands trembling as she stared back at the asylum. The massive stone structure loomed in the distance, dark and foreboding, but there was something different now. The oppressive, malevolent force that had once radiated from the building felt diminished, weakened, but not gone. Mila was crying softly, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she could barely believe they had escaped. "We're out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're really out." Tristan sat beside her, his face pale but resolute. "Yeah," he said, his voice shaky. "But is it over?" Cassie didn't answer immediately. Her gaze was still locked on the asylum, her heart still racing with the remnants of fear. The building sat silent now, its windows dark, the oppressive presence no longer pressing down on them. But deep inside, she knew the truth. "It's not over," she whispered, more to herself than to the others. Tristan turned to her, confusion flickering in his eyes. "What do you mean? We escaped?" Cassie shook her head. "The asylum? It's still there. We barely scratched the surface. Whatever that thing was, it's ancient, and it's not done with us." Mila shuddered, her hands gripping her arms tightly. "So what now? We just leave? Pretend this never happened?" Cassie stood slowly, her eyes narrowing as she looked back at the building that had nearly consumed them. "We can't just leave it. If we do, it'll find someone else. It'll keep going, keep feeding. We have to stop it, for good." Tristan stared at her, disbelief mixing with exhaustion. "How? We barely survived in there. You saw what it did to us." Cassie turned to face him, her expression grim but determined. "There's something deeper in there, something more than what we saw. The altar, the symbols, it's all part of something bigger. We need to find out what it is and destroy it." Mila's eyes widened with horror. You're talking about going back? Cassie nodded slowly. Not now. Not yet. But eventually, yes. Silence fell over the group as they processed what that meant. The idea of going back into the asylum, of facing the ancient evil that had almost claimed them, was unthinkable. But Cassie was right. It wasn't over. Not yet. "We'll need to be prepared," Tristan said finally, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Next time, we'll be ready." Cassie looked back at the asylum one last time, her jaw set with determination. "Next time?" she echoed softly. They turned away from the building and began walking through the twisted forest, the moonlight casting long, eerie shadows across the path. The asylum loomed behind them, silent for now, but Cassie could feel its presence still lingering, watching, waiting. The nightmare wasn't over, but they had survived the first encounter, and next time they would come back stronger. As they disappeared into the forest, the wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves on the ground, and from the darkness of the asylum, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper echoed through the night, carried on the wind. "You cannot escape forever."